Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Matt McKinnon, and I'm the manager of events at Kitchener Public Library, and I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's event. Before we begin the program, I would like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. As we gather, we are reminded that the library is situated on land that is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here and reaffirm our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. I want to welcome you and thank you for attending our Fall 85 Queen author events, part of the City of Kitchener's Imagine It series of programs and events. So at this time, I would like to introduce and then invite on screen Dr. Sarah Birch, who will introduce tonight's 85 Queen special guest. Following the introduction, Catherine will do a short reading from her book, and then Dr. Birch will join her on screen for a conversation. So Dr. Sarah Birch holds a Canada Research Chair in Sustainability, Governance, and Innovation, and is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She is the executive director of the University of Waterloo's Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change and is currently lead author of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Her research explores transformative responses to climate change at the community scale, innovative strategies for making progress on sustainability, and the unique contributions that small businesses can make to solving this complex challenge. Dr. Birch holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia, a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Oxford, and she was elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars in 2017. Her most recent book, along with co-author Dr. Sarah Harris, is entitled Understanding Climate Change, Science, Policy, and Practice. Dr. Birch's book received a review from Katharine Hayhoe, and I'd like to share that now. Packed with intuitive analogies and compelling examples, this book simply and clearly unpacks the complex science and impacts of climate change. It's perfect for students who want to understand not only why the climate is changing, but why it matters so profoundly to every living thing on this planet. I wish this book were available when I took my first climate class. I'm looking forward to this conversation, given the connection these two scientists already have through these books. So with that, I'd like to welcome Sarah.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to the Kitchener Public Library for inviting me to have this chat tonight with Catherine. I'm really excited about our time here tonight. So I'd like to begin by just introducing you all to her and her incredible accomplishments. I've been thrilled to have our lives and our circles intersect on a couple of occasions in the last couple of years. So here we are together. Catherine Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. In her role as chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, Catherine is responsible for the wider portfolio of global climate advocacy and adaptation work. She's also the endowed professor in public policy and public law and Paul W. Horn Distinguished Professor at Texas Tech University. Catherine is also a remarkable communicator, as I'm sure you will all see this evening, who's received the National Center for Science Education's Friend of the Planet Award, the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, the Sierra Club's Distinguished Service Award, and been named to a number of lists, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers, Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Leaders, and the United Nations Champion of the Earth in Science and Innovation. Catherine was lead author for the US 2nd, 3rd, and 4th National Climate Assessments, hosts and produces the PBS digital series Global Weirding, and serves on advisory committees for a broad range of organizations, including the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, the Earth Science Women's Network, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Her TED Talk, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has been viewed over 5 million times. Catherine retains an academic appointment at Texas Tech University, where she is Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor. She has a BSc in physics from the University of Toronto and an MS and PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois, and has been awarded several honorary doctorates. What a fabulous career so far. I'm so thrilled to have you here to talk about your newest book. So I'd invite you, Catherine, to join us and to read an excerpt from your book.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for that kind introduction, Sarah. And before anyone asks, I will just say, yes, if you know a Hayhoe, they are related to me. I am from Etobicoke. There are many Hayhoes throughout Southern Ontario. We are all related. So just getting that out of the way. I would be delighted to read some of my book, which is, as you know, Saving Us. Why? Because it's not about saving the planet. The planet will still orbit the sun long after we're gone. It is literally us and a lot of the other living things on this planet that are at risk. So often we're asked and we wonder, what gives you hope? When it comes to climate change, this huge issue, how can I, one person, make a difference? I'm not a prime minister or a president or a CEO or some big influencer on social media. How can I make a difference? Well, my book is all about how each one of us can make a difference. And here's an excerpt that explains. It begins with Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura, who has been studying human behavior since before I was born. Now, Albert Bandura was born in Alberta, although he moved to the US, and he just passed away at age 95 this summer after I wrote the book. In 1977, he proposed and proved that people change their behavior if they feel what he called efficacy, which he defined as the belief in one's capabilities to organize and execute a course of action. Feel is not really the right word because efficacy is not technically an emotion. Rather, psychologists refer to it as a cognitive process. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that if you think you can do something, like hiring your neighbor's installer to put some solar panels on your roof, you're more likely to do it. And if you think that what you do will make a difference, for example, you'll save money and you'll feel good about yourself, that's even better. Studies of people in different countries show that people's sense of efficacy when it comes to climate change is not high. Even those of us who are concerned about climate change often feel as though we aren't able to make much of a difference. In the United States, one survey showed that over 50% of Americans feel helpless when they think about climate change, and another survey found that 50% don't know where to start when it comes to climate action. So what builds our sense of efficacy when it comes to climate action? Research is still emerging, but the bottom line is pretty intuitive. When you hear or see or learn about what real solutions look like and how many of them are already being implemented or will be in the near future, that increases your sense of efficacy. And when you see someone else doing something or you find out about something that you can do yourself, that increases your efficacy too. It's a true positive feedback cycle. When we feel empowered to act individually or communally, that makes us not only more likely to act, but more likely to support others who do. It's a very human response that has been identified again and again around the world. It also inoculates us against despair. For example, young people who are anxious about climate change, and a new survey just came out a couple of weeks ago showing that 84% of young people in 10 countries around the world, including Canada and the US, are worried about climate change. So young people who are anxious about climate change aren't paralyzed by it if they're able to act, if they're doing something about it. It's not about being a lone ranger either. Collective efficacy is even more important. The idea that together as a community, we can make a difference. That's why it's so important to seek out like-minded people. Other athletes, parents, fellow birders or Rotarians, people who share our faith. Together, our actions add up. It's not just us alone anymore. And I would add, there's so many organizations for winter athletes like Protect Our Winters, or for people of faith like Arasha Canada, or neighborhood associations, or your city, or your school. There's so many organizations of people who share our values that we can join together with and use our voice together with. So I tell the story in the book about one of these organizations called Citizens Climate Lobby, which are in Canada, and they're actually in 60 countries around the world. They were founded by Marshall Saunders, who was a former Shell oil employee. In his own words, he, quote, awoke to the climate crisis when he saw the Al Gore documentary An Inconvenient Truth and discovered the power that a well-organized, properly trained group of citizens could wield to make the world a better place. He founded Citizens Climate Lobby in 2007, so not that long ago, 14 years ago. By the time he passed away in 2019, it had over 600 active chapters spread across 60 countries in every continent except Antarctica. In the United States, CCL has created bipartisan climate solutions caucuses in the Senate and in Congress. In Canada, CCL was one of the organizations that successfully lobbied for our carbon tax. In Slovakia, I've shared the stage with a CCL advocate who explained the benefits of this approach to a coal-dependent country. And as I've traveled, I've met business people, faith leaders, retired people, even many academics, from literature professors to astrophysicists, who wanted to advocate for climate solutions but felt helpless until they found a local CCL chapter. There, together with other concerned community members, they could be encouraged and encourage others. People could grow their collective efficacy through learning more about climate solutions and having conversations with our neighbors, our elected officials, with people where we work, with people who live near we do, all to advocate for change. So we can use our voices, but when we join together with others, the impact of our voice is magnified. So who are you? What do you share with others? And who could you connect with to have those conversations on climate change?
Thank you so much. That was a really well-chosen passage, and not coincidentally, it aligns with a whole bunch of questions that I have for you that we can maybe dig into as we discuss. So thank you very much for that. So maybe let's, if you don't mind, let's just sort of ease into the substance of the book and the topics that you raise, because in my experience writing, you evolve as you write. You grow and change as you conceive of the idea and as you sort of move through to execution, and then kind of start from scratch again and try over and kind of go through that growth. So I'm just wondering, as a writer, as a scientist, as a communicator, what surprised you, or what sort of jumped out at you or changed your mind, or what was striking to you as you moved through the process of writing the book?
Yes, you're absolutely right, because it does change you. So I started to write Saving Us, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and then I organized and I wrote some more, and I ended up throwing away 3/4 of what I wrote. I mean, maybe I'll use a little bit of it later. Maybe there's some things that just didn't fit in.
Save it.
Yes, it's in a Word document somewhere, but I wrote about 250,000 words probably, which is an insane amount of words, and only 75,000 made it into the book. And that's because, as you just said, how I thought about this issue evolved as I wrote about it. So I did a TED Talk, and the link there is in the chat right now. And so because of that, I felt like, okay, I've got a pretty good handle on how I want to frame this. And then I started writing and I realized, what about this? But what about that? And then I was really sort of trying to unpack the emotions that go with climate change, writing about fear and how we respond to fear, and then writing about guilt and how we respond to the guilt that we all carry as people living in relatively wealthy countries, but the guilt that is enhanced often deliberately by people who are either trying to feel better themselves or people who are trying to delay action and using guilt very ruthlessly to do so. And so as I dug into those, I realized, well, I understand intuitively how they affect me, but what about the science? So I had to stop, I had to find all these different studies about guilt and hope and fear and motivation from all who knows what reaches of academia and the internet. And then what about how people change? Well, there's people who've written books about how people change. In fact, there's literally, I think, 4 books with the same title on how to change. Well, what do we know about change that we could apply to climate change? So I kept sort of stopping and then going out and researching and reading more, and then coming back and digesting it all. And then I was almost finished the book. And in fact, the advanced copy had already been printed. So if you or if anybody else has an advanced copy, it had already been printed. And I got my sister to read the book. My sister lives in Toronto. She lives in High Park. And she's like, well, you wrote this whole book on how to talk about climate change, but you don't have a chapter on how to actually do it. I want a chapter that says, here's how you start. here's what you say next. Here's where you go there, and here's how you end it. I was like,
Thanks.
you're right,
Thanks,
there is no
sister.
chapter on that. Yes. So I had to write a whole new chapter on how do you actually do it, because what's the point? It's like you write a whole book about knitting and you never actually tell anybody how to cast on the stitches on the needle. So yes, there was a lot, and it really changed the way I think about the book too. So I'm kind of curious, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw that question back on you, because you wrote this really great textbook that, as I said in my endorsement, I wish it had been around when I took my first class on climate change at the University of Toronto. And of course, it's a U of T Press book. And your book is called Understanding Climate Change, Science, Policy, and Practice. So what's something that you feel like changed in your perspective as you wrote your book?
Well, I mean, interestingly, the book that you reviewed was the second edition. So there was some evolution there in terms of, moving from the first to the second edition and seeing, how has the world changed? How have our conversations around climate change evolved? And is the world in a different place, in 2021 than it is in 2014, which obviously is. So there had been a lot of change there. I was more convinced than ever, and I think that this is a common theme between yours and mine, co-authored, of course, with Sarah Harris. And she's such an excellent paleoclimatologist and brought that sort of natural science dimension. But I'm fully convinced that this is a social and a political issue, more than a technical or purely traditional environmental one, which is, how you started off your opening remarks in regard to your book. And so it became really important to me to do that justice. Speaking of justice, think about the justice dimensions of the transition and how to try and create as rich a picture of the transition that's required, and which is difficult. I mean, as I'm sure you grappled with in your book, there's so much ground to cover, and all aspects of the issue deserve their own deep thinking and their own nuance and their own clarity of thought, and that's virtually impossible to do in one single book. So it's a tricky business.
It totally is. No, I appreciate that. And it's interesting that you say that, because so I'm a climate scientist myself. My undergraduate degree is in physics, my master's and PhD in atmospheric science. I am a climate scientist in the sense that I look at atmospheric dynamics and how those affect drought patterns and rainfall at the regional scale. I work with cities and organizations who are trying to plan for climate impacts, developing high resolution projections that they can use for planning. Yet I sit in the political science department. I actually moved from geoscience to political science a number of years ago. And there's always many reasons for a move, but one of them was because climate change is now the most political science that there is. And the barriers that we face, I started to realize exactly what you realized as you wrote that book. The barriers we face to action are not more science. It's not a greater understanding of our planet. Not that we couldn't benefit from that, and we're always learning more. But the barriers we face are primarily cultural, political, social, and economic. That's where the roadblock is, and that's what we have to get over in order to, as my book says, it's about saving us. And so how do we get over those roadblocks that some of them are built through our history, some of them are being deliberately constructed, some of them are being shored up by some of the richest companies in the world. How do we get over those roadblocks to climate action to save us?
So that brings to mind, a question that occurred to me as you were reading the passage of the book about efficacy. And, a question that I always get, and maybe you can help me answer it better, is, I get a lot of questions about the tension or the disconnect between individual action and collective action, that the scale of the challenge requires something much deeper and more pervasive and transformative than you or I can do individually. So collective change, policy change by our leaders, by our decision makers about our transportation system and the way our cities function and where we get our energy from. Those are the scale of decisions that need to be made. But you talk in the book about why you change your own individual behavior, and you talk about it as a source of inspiration and also credibility as a climate communicator and scientist. But how do you, aside from the issue of sort of joining a community and talking about climate change and deepening our sense of collective efficacy, what is the link in your mind between individual actions and collective decisions taken on our behalf?
Well, you've completely hit the nail on the head. because on social media these days, especially on Twitter, where there's a lot of people who really care very deeply and are very passionate about climate change, there's this false debate between, is it about personal responsibility or is it about changing the system? And people will argue to the death about it and then bring knives out in these debates. And my answer to that question is, whether it's about personal responsibility or changing the system, is yes. Why? Because a system is made up of people. How does a system change when people use their voices? Now, if we look back in our industrialized society, we have changed in really significant ways. And I think a powerful example is the fact that 200 years ago, the economy of the United States and of the UK at that time was primarily built on the horrendous practice of owning other human beings and profiting off their labor, slavery. How did that change? It was not because the King of England woke up one day and decided it had to, or the Prime Minister, or even a collection of members of Parliament. Absolutely not. It was because very ordinary people, some of whose names we know today, but more of them we don't know, decided that that is not the way the world could or should be. So those people, if they owned slaves, freed their slaves, but most of them didn't. Those people, if they ate sugar, boycotted sugar, but that didn't shut down the plantations in the Caribbean. What happened was they used their voices to advocate for change, to band together, to speak to people who are elected officials or decision makers, to eventually get it passed into rule of law. And so individual actions were absolutely essential to getting that to happen. And the people who took those actions, who used their voices, made changes in their personal lives, but they recognized that that was not sufficient, that we needed more, and that the greatest force that every single one of us has is our voice.
I really appreciate that lens, and that voice, it seems to me doesn't, so there's a role for activism. There's a really powerful role for vocal and persistent and present activism and advocacy. But also, I always recall an interview that I did with a city councilor back when I was studying, municipal city level climate change policy. And he said, "Oh, Sarah, you don't understand. I don't lead, I follow. I take the temperature of the people who are my constituents who voted for me, and I do what they say. And if this isn't on their radar and I'm not hearing from them, then I don't have permission to act, to innovate, to lead, essentially, to take
Exactly.
those steps forward."
And that highlights something too, is because people often feel like, well, politicians aren't going to listen to me. If I email the Prime Minister, he's not going to listen. Well, you know what? There are a lot more decision makers who can make a lot bigger decisions at the level of a city. Cities have so much under their control. And if you talk to someone at the city level, chances are if you live there, you can talk to them, right? And our ridings aren't even that big. If we email our representatives in our ridings, especially during election campaigns, they will typically see our email and respond. So in Canada, we have an even greater ability, I feel like, to have our voice heard than many people in the US, where there's, it's really hard to get your foot in the door of an elected representative or a senator in these huge districts in the US. But in Canada, we have the opportunity to connect with people. And even in the US, people have the opportunity to connect, especially at the city level and also at the state level with state representatives. And a lot can be made at that level. It is not just a country thing.
So I totally agree. It does seem like the local level is the place where we have the most intimate relationship with decision makers who, change the way our communities look and our neighborhoods function. And it's also the scale where climate change impacts actually play out, and where the decarbonization has to, the reducing our greenhouse gas emissions really becomes tangible. And I want to come back to that, but I also want your advice because we're heading into the next round of international climate change negotiations in Glasgow in a few weeks here. And as you know, I do work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And for those of you out there who aren't familiar with that body, this is all scientists who come together to assess what all the other scientists are saying about climate change and try and feed that into the global treaty making process, the global process where we decide what to do next, and then our countries take that on board and see what we're going to do with it. So I'm wondering, what are there's this disconnect I find between the local level action, the really tangible stuff that we all can do, and the changes we see in the spaces that we live, and then these extremely high level international negotiations and the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol, before it. What do you think is changing about the nature of those global debates, and like what next for global progress on climate change?
Things are definitely changing. They are very different now than they were in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. There is much greater awareness around the world. Corporations are finally getting the message that they have to get on board. The economy cannot float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides. It's not the economy or the environment like the Harper government always used to try to convince us of. It's the economy plus the environment or nothing. That's the choice. So economy plus environment or absolutely nothing. So companies are starting to get that. And although there's many accusations flying around of greenwashing, of companies setting up like 2050 goals and having no plans on how to get there, for every company who's doing that, there is a company who is genuinely engaging, setting short-term and long-term goals, changing the way they get their energy, decarbonizing their supply chain, sometimes even changing their entire business model, investing in different ways. There is change happening in the private sector in a way that was not happening 5 years ago at all. Or very, 5 years ago, like Patagonia, right?
Patagonia.
Yeah, exactly. And like a couple of, headline organizations that are all crunching granola. They were definitely doing stuff. But if you were talking about the Microsofts of the world, they were not on board. And now you have, Bill Gates writing climate books. So that definitely has changed. What else has changed? Well, we know that when we first started off, our world was headed to a warming of 4 degrees or more by the end of the century, 4 to 5 degrees. Now, thanks to all the commitments that countries are making, we have a fighting chance, a 66% chance of holding warming to 2.7 degrees. It's still not enough, but 2.7 is a lot better than 4 to 5. So we've already kind of hit the low-hanging fruit, but now we need more. And that's why, for example, our recent election was so important, because it was a chance to push the government to up their ambition so that we would be bringing our potluck dish to the table, so to speak, because the Paris Agreement is like this giant potluck where everybody brings different dishes. We each need to bring a proportional dish to our emissions to help reach the Paris targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And you know what I hear most of all, and you probably hear this too, Sarah, wherever we go, people say, what about? So I'm, in Canada, everybody says, what about these other countries? We're just 2% of global emissions. So what about all these other countries? Why don't they do something first? You talk to Norway, Norway's like, oh, we're such a little country. What we do doesn't matter. What about those other countries? The pandemic actually caught me in Ireland, where I was doing one of my bundled trips where I only travel in person if I'm doing like 18 or 20 trips in the same time. So I was in the middle of one of these bundled trips in Ireland, and people were like, you've probably never heard this before, but we're such a small country. Why does what we do matter? And of course I laughed, because that's what we hear here. And then in the United States, people say, well, what about China? And then in China, people say, well, per person, per capita, as well as our cumulative emissions, what about the United States? They're number 1 in the world. So it's all about finger pointing about, I don't want to do anything until they do something. But the reality is we all have to do something, or we all lose together. And so that's what the meeting in Glasgow is about. It's about every country showing up, putting their dish on the table and figuring out, all right, who brought a nice big salad with fresh vegetables and dressing? Who brought a tiny little frozen pot pie from the back of the freezer that they got at like Costco or Sam's Club? Who made a giant, nice, beautiful looking apple pie that when you cut into it is full of hot air? And it's a time to sort of measure and stack up all the different contributions and see who still needs to bring more.
So that, yes, I agree. The conversation now seems to be urgency and acceleration, right? It's like, I think we've established by now that this is a clear and present danger and requires urgent action. But your reference to the private sector's progress and sort of more leadership from different companies, and you mentioned it in the book as well. It struck me that the sort of not so great underbelly of the increasing level of conversation about this and the increasing level of sophistication of language we're all using around climate change is that sometimes it's really hard to tease apart or peel back the layers and assess the authenticity of commitments, right? So you'll see, you mentioned Nespresso doing great things, of course, owned by Nestle, doing not great things on water. And so you get these very, very contradictory actions, which, is the way of things. The world is a complex place. But how do the people here tonight, those who are interested, those who are concerned, but those who are not necessarily in the room, with it in a Nestle board meeting or whatever, how do they assess sincerity or authenticity of those commitments?
Well, that's a good question. I would love to hear your thoughts on that too. Because you're right, things are changing so quickly. It's a little bit like the Wild West in terms of net zero commitments and plans and ESG and things like that. And what we really need, it's like the same thing that happened with organic food, right? So originally people could slap whatever label they wanted, natural, organic, grass-fed, whatever. And then along comes, like in the United States, the USDA was like, okay, here is the list of things that you have to check off before you can put the official label on what you're doing. So it's almost like we need if you truly have a net zero goal of by 2050 or whatever year, here's what you need to tick. You need to tick all these boxes before you can get the official, seal, the good housekeeping seal of approval, so to speak, of your goal. We need those types of standards because how are we and I literally mean, how are you and I, let alone anybody else listening, supposed to be digging into the details of what every single company is doing when you have the head of Mars just making a commitment just last week saying, we're listening to the words of Greta Thunberg. We realize that we need a net zero goal. We realize this is important. That all sounds wonderful, but what are they actually doing? I don't know. So we need something though where we can make a decision, because right now we don't have that. We do have some information though. So for example, a report just came out a couple of months ago, and you probably saw it, that looked at how much money our big banks are putting into fossil fuel funding. And there were some very familiar names on that list. RBC was on the list. I'm pretty sure Scotiabank was on the list. I think I saw TD somewhere there as well. And right at the top actually was JP Morgan / Chase, which, living in the States as I do now, I had a Chase credit card. And it had never occurred to me to look at, where I banked or where. And so when I saw that Chase was at the very top of that list, I called them. I told them why I was cutting up my card and canceling my account. They said, oh, all banks fund fossil fuels. And I was like, not all, and you're number one. And then I sent a message to any of their sustainability people that I could find on LinkedIn. Not that they replied, but I sent the message. And I posted online too, and I shared that information with people, and I shared the list so people could look up the banks themselves. And so there's things like investing where we put our retirement funds, and I talk about that in the book. There's things that, the banks that we use, there's the different companies that we buy from. But you're right, it's really hard to tell the difference now. And what would you say to that? What do you think we need?
What do we need? Yeah, no, I think you're bang on when it comes to transparency and information. And we just don't, even those who study this issue just don't have access to nearly good enough information about what firms are actually doing once they make promises. But I also think there's a really important question about whether or not, a firm can be, a big corporation can be as transparent as it is, but I'm not sure that we're having the types of conversations we need to have about just how deep the change has to be to get to a net zero by 2050 world. This isn't about marginal, efficiency improvements. This is about something much deeper and more fundamental than that. And that's, as you say, we've plucked some low-hanging fruit, and now we're getting, in some cases, now we're getting to the real crux of the problem, which is going to require, maybe some deeper changes than we had thought. And I keep on seeing sort of conventional visions of the future, when the New York Times does a piece on climate futures or whatever, it's like your community is going to look exactly the same, and your life and your job is going to be exactly the same, except it's all going to be fueled by renewable energy, and that'll be sufficient. Yeah. And I'm not sure that that's accurate.
I prefer the book that Christiana Figueres wrote called The Future We Choose. And Sheila, I don't know if Kitchener Library has a copy of that, but The Future We Choose was really inspirational because, of course, Christiana Figueres is the Costa Rican diplomat who shepherded the Paris negotiations. Recalcitrant countries, companies, cities. She just sort of herded that enormous group of global leaders into a Paris Agreement. So if anybody has the right to be frustrated, to be angry, to just want to go live in a cave for the rest of her life, I think she has earned that right. Yet what did she do as soon as the Paris Agreement was inked? She turned around and she wrote the most relentlessly hopeful and optimistic book I've ever read, called The Future We Choose. And she envisions what the world would look like if we met the Paris targets. And the world she envisions is not the same as today. It's better than today, but it's different. A city where our walls and our roofs and our streets grow our energy, where green spaces are prioritized, where people walk rather than having to drive, where we're much more connected as a community, where the air is cleaner, where our diets are different. Thank you. There's The Future We Choose right in the Zoom chat there. And I love the way she concluded. She said, the biggest lesson we learned is that we were only ever as doomed as we believed ourselves to be. And the lesson she has for us, I think, is something I've been thinking about recently. I didn't write about it in the book, but what you said made me think about it. We're starting from here. And we're like, okay, here we are today. Let's change this and this and this. Oh, that only gets us 10% of the way. Okay, let's change this. It's big. Oh, an extra 5%. Where can we find more changes? Oh, maybe 18%. So this is the way that we're going. But if we really want to get there, we have to start with the blank canvas. If we truly started with the blank canvas of where we want to be, and that's what Christiana did with her book, and painted the picture of where we want to be, and then said, what do we need to do to get there? What can we take with us, and what do we have to leave behind? That is a totally different picture. And I don't know of any company or any country that's doing that.
This is like music to my ears, because this is what, from the scenario, you I'm sure know this from the scenarios community, this is backcasting, right? This is jumping to the future and then working back instead of just rolling forward to the future. And I agree, I think, and your book speaks to this, that we have to have something we're pushing towards, not just something we're pushing away from, things we're trying to shed, things we're trying to stop, things we're trying to do less badly. It's that vision of what we're actually aspiring to become that I think is much more motivating and creative and hopeful and interesting than all of the things we've done wrong, which are
yes. It's sort of the focusing on our sins versus focusing on the future that we could get. And a little bit, so you were probably watching the Olympics this summer. I was watching the Olympics too. I got to actually come home for the first time since the pandemic began. So I got to watch all the Canadian coverage too. And when people were diving, they would dive and then they would come out of the water, and immediately their coach would have this giant iPad that they would go over in slow motion and correct every little tiny thing that they were doing. Yes. And so then you're hyper focused on the angle of your foot. But in reality, we just want to make sure that we land safely. We have no guarantee that we're going to hit the water safely in a way that's going to, allow us to actually survive that landing. And so focusing on where the water is and how we can get there safely is much more important than the angle of our feet. And yet I feel like that's sort of the level of detail that the discussion is stuck on.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question about the actions that we take and behavior change and everything that goes into that, because I noticed for good reason, your book focuses the majority of its conversations around reducing greenhouse gas emissions or dealing with the carbon problem, and less time on the adaptation side. So how do we protect ourselves from climate change impacts and make our communities more resilient? It's completely laced through. But I'm wondering, when you think about the actions that individuals need to take or the conversations that individuals need to have, are the same challenges present when we talk about how to adapt and when we talk about how to protect our communities as are present when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? There's a different set of challenges.
I think it's a very different set of challenges because adaptation is local. So I was talking with European colleagues recently, and they were sharing the whole, EU mitigation strategy and all the carbon emission reductions and what each country is contributing. It's all organized neatly, and there's a website, and you can access all the information. So I'm an adaptation scientist. I study how people are building resilience and preparing for the impacts. So I innocently asked, "Oh, so where's the website for adaptation?" And they said, "Oh, nobody can have a EU-wide website for adaptation. You can't collect all those projects. They're all individual, independent, small-scale projects. All of them are completely different depending on what city or what region or what country you're in." And I thought to myself, well, I still think you could do something, but I got the point. I got the point that our emissions are very much collected among just a small number of large actors. So let me just give you some numbers. 12 countries produce almost 70% of our annual emissions, 12 countries. 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of carbon emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. 90 companies. 20 companies are responsible for 1/3 of carbon emissions since the 1960s. So there's a huge kind of collection of responsibility in just a few hands when it comes to mitigating climate. So that's where system-wide changes are so important. If each of us as individuals did everything we could within the current system, we wouldn't even reduce 25% of our emissions. We need the system to change as well as ourselves. But then with adaptation, it's hyper-local, because Kitchener versus Waterloo might have different city planning that makes it differentially more vulnerable or less vulnerable to climate change, right? And then if you looked at Mississauga versus Toronto, or if you looked at, one town that's located on the coast versus another that's inland, adaptation is hyper local, but a lot of adaptation actions can also be taken at the hyper local level. They don't need federal legislation. They need action at the level of the city, at the level of the district, at the level maybe of the province. So it is completely different, and we're seeing a lot more positive momentum there because people see the impacts. They're actually right here in front of our eyes, and we know what we have to prepare to adapt to. And I think we see this reflected actually in leadership at that level. So, in the US, climate change is the most politically polarized issue in the whole country, and it's been that way since the Obama administration. Even the craziness with COVID and vaccines and masks today, which sad to say we're seeing in Canada as well, even all of that has reached the level of polarization of climate change, but it's still about equal. So what that means is the number one predictor of whether people agree that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the impacts are serious is simply where they fall on the political spectrum. And sadly, if you compare the polling results for Canada by riding over who agrees the Earth is warming due to human emissions with who voted for who in the recent election, you see a pretty strong overlap there too. So all that to say though, when you take it down to the local level, when we decrease the psychological distance, when we recognize that climate change is here, not over there, now, not the future, relevant and concrete rather than abstract, that actually overcomes our political polarization. Science has shown that. They've actually done studies showing that. And so a couple of years ago, I was talking to the US Conference of Mayors about climate adaptation, resilience, and preparedness. And after I was done, a mayor from one of the suburbs of Chicago came marching up to me and he said, "I'm a Republican." And normally if somebody marches up to a climate scientist and says, "I'm a Republican," the conversation usually kind of goes downhill from there. But he kept on going and he said, "And everybody needs to care about climate change because it's clearly affecting the places where we live. It's not a Republican or a Democrat issue. We all need to build resilience to the impacts we can't avoid. And here's what's happening near Chicago, and here's what we're doing about it." And I was like, "Why don't you run for president?" And he's like, "No, I'm not running for president. I'm a mayor." Well, that just sort of illustrates, right, the power of local politics.
Yeah. So this is interesting. And I absolutely agree that in some ways, the impacts of climate change are so immediate and so local that they spur us to essentially emergency management, hopefully better than that. But in many cases, that's what it turns out to be. But I do wonder, there's a strong justice argument to be made that we here in the rich industrialized West are responsible for the vast majority of emissions, and those in lower income countries are suffering, by far the most extreme impacts. So there is some role for global collaboration or sharing of adaptation technologies or sharing of money so that those marginalized or hardest hit vulnerable populations can respond as well. So how have you approached those conversations with the Rotarians and the neighborhood associations and the folks you talk about? Do you get into that territory of what our responsibility is through a justice lens, to other communities around the world?
Well, it depends on whether justice is important to them in terms of beginning the conversation. Now, my bias is I think justice is important to everybody. And The reason I'm a climate scientist is because when I found out climate change was a justice issue, that's what made me become a climate scientist. When I was planning to be an astronomer studying galaxy clustering around quasars, that's actually what my first 5 papers are in, is in, first of all, variable stars, and then second of all, galaxy clustering. But when I took a class at U of T on climate change, just literally to fulfill a breadth requirement, that's why I took it, I was completely shocked to learn that climate change is, first of all, no longer a future or distant issue. But I was even more shocked to learn that climate change is not only an environmental issue. I had seen it as an issue that affects plants and animals and the planet, but not humans. And when I learned that climate change is a health issue, that it is a resource issue, it affects our food and our water and our air, climate change is a national security issue, but most of all, climate change is an issue of poverty, of hunger, of lack of access to clean water and basic resources, education, healthcare. Climate change is a humanitarian issue. It disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people right here in Canada, as well as on the other side of the world. It's not only about low-income countries. In my book, I talk about how I was asked to speak at a benefit for a homeless shelter in Halifax, and how I spent the day touring the city and the shelters with the executive director. Well, she told me about how summer heat waves, increasing heavy rainfall events, even the hurricanes that now hit the Maritimes fairly regularly, how all of those disproportionately affect the women and the children who are homeless, who live on the streets, or who are just sort of hanging on to their jobs, to their mental health appointments, who rely on public transit to get where they're going. They are the ones who are most affected by these disasters that are being exacerbated by a changing climate. And then, of course, we've got the 3.5 billion poorest people in the world who are responsible for 7% of global emissions. Yet climate change has increased the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world, and we count among the richest, by 25% since 1960. So this justice issue is definitely a global justice issue, but it's a justice issue right here at home too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I have in the back of my head, I'm part of a process that's just unfolding now at the federal level here in Canada to build our first national adaptation strategy. So this is all, oh, sorry, I have a small child. I don't know if you can hear them cry. Anyway, they're fine.
Who doesn't?
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot about what is that future that we are aiming for? And I think it's a really complex question when we talk about adaptation and when we talk about what we're trying to protect, because many folks here in this country, in this community, across Canada would say, there's a lot of things that are wrong with the way our economy is functioning right now, and for who it benefits, and the way our communities are functioning right now. So actually, protecting what we have right now is not a win. There needs to be some really big changes to our public health, to the state of our environment, to marginalized communities and such. And that should be part of the climate change conversation. So I really appreciate that you have that entry point of justice and community benefit as your position.
Yes, absolutely, for sure. And everything from our city planning to our housing. And we haven't even touched on the issue of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands, because especially in Canada, for example, a lot of our Indigenous people live in places that are being even more affected by climate change. The further north you go, the faster climate is changing. And people whose way of life is built on the land, whose communities are accessed by winter roads only, who depend on the sea ice coming in or leaving at a certain time, those people, it is past levels of dangers for them. And
Absolutely. That
is just absolutely not fair. I mean, how do people get to say, oh, well, this is my lifestyle and this is what I need to support my lifestyle, where other people's lifestyle has already completely disappeared as a result of our choices? And it's hard to cope with those situations, but it's exactly what you said. It isn't about keeping what we have. It's about something better. How can we build something that is better for all of us together, not just keeping what we have, which is already a profoundly unjust and unequitable society?
Absolutely. So to circle back to the beginning of our conversation and loop in one of the audience questions, I just want to come back to this question that we started with. You said you wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of words that you ended up slashing and mercilessly removing from the final product. what left? What did you have to exclude from this book that, still sort of twinges your heart and might be part of your next one? What else do you want to say?
So many stories. As you know, my book is full of stories. I tried to have at least 1 or 2 stories per chapter so people wouldn't get too loaded down. And so there are stories that I just had to cut because they didn't quite make the point that needed to be made. So for example, I love learning and talking about other scientists. And it amazes me how the basic science of understanding that digging up coal back then, and then obviously oil and gas today, and burning it produces heat trapping gases that are building up in the planet, building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. That science was done in the 1800s. And I am so inspired by the scientists at that time who did that work. And I was not able to include hardly anything about those amazing scientists, even though I just love telling stories about them, about Mrs. Eunice Foote, who is from upstate New York, so just across the border. She was an amateur scientist because in those days, especially in upstate New York, women weren't scientists. But she went to a really good girls' school that had probably arguably the best chemistry lab for women in the whole United States at that time. She married a man, a judge, Elisha Foote, who really enjoyed doing experiments himself. And so she set up a lab in her backyard, and she, using glass tubes and carbon dioxide levels and a pump that she thinks was a little dodgy, she writes about how she wasn't quite sure about her equipment. She actually measured the sensitivity of the planet to doubling CO2 levels, which is just blows my mind. And it's really amazing because her maiden name was Newton. And that wasn't an accident. I went back. I like doing ancestry.com for fun just because there's nothing to do with climate change. So I used it for good. I went back and I actually found that she is a distant cousin of Sir Isaac Newton, which is amazingly cool. I then managed, using ancestry.com and LinkedIn, to track down her 2 surviving great-great-great-granddaughters and ask if they might have any photos of Eunice in their attics or family records. And they haven't found anything so far. Now, if you go to Google, you will find a mention of Eunice Foote with photos, but those are not her photos. Those are her daughters. So don't send them to me and say that they are, because believe me, I've been in the Smithsonian archives looking for photos of Eunice. But anyways, I would have just loved to tell sort of stories like that of scientists of the past, but this was not the book for it. So all those stories got cut.
That's great. Well, the stories are such a beautiful and elegant and sort of, visceral and emotional way to connect with what, as you say, can be a very abstract concept and somewhere else, some other time or place. And I really appreciate all the incredible work you've done here to sort of bring it home and make it a part of everyday life and a part of the communities that we all reside in. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Sheila, who's being so prompt and putting all these great links in the chat about Eunice Foote. If you want to know more about Eunice, that's awesome. Well, do we have time to take another question or two? We could do a speed round, or?
I think we have a couple minutes. We'll see if there's any that we have going here. I've been keeping my eye. Oh, yes. Okay. Sure. So let's see what questions we have in the Q&A that we have yet to answer. Okay, so let's deal with this first one about building community through focusing on a climate emergency. And you mentioned that efficacy increases when we see what other people are doing. Mm-hmm. So could you give us, as to sort of end on a high note, some of those stories of solutions, those stories of examples of what other people are doing that help us sort of increase our sense of efficacy and hope for the future?
Well, what that sounds like, Beth is the person who asked the question, is the story about Glenn in my book. So I have a story about Glenn that was just one of the most, it's one of the stories that mean the most to me. And I'll tell you a bit of the story, but read the book for the rest of it. Glenn, I met him when I was giving a talk at the London School of Economics about 5 months after my TED Talk came out. So I did a TED Talk about how the most important thing we as individuals can do is talk about climate change. And a couple months later, I was doing one of those bundled, trips when I'm doing, 20 different things. And it had been a long day. I had started off that day with like a breakfast at 7 a.m. and then lectures, seminars, lunches, afternoon, and then London School of Economics was the last thing of the day, and I was beat. I mean, it had been 9 straight hours of talking and packing and everything I could to one day. So I'm walking back down the aisle, and I see this older man, obviously sort of waiting for me, and he said, "Hey, I just wanted to tell you that I watched your TED Talk." I was like, "Oh, really? That's awesome. Thank you for letting me know." And they said, "And I've been talking to people about climate change." And I was like, "Great." And he said, and I've been keeping a list of all the people that I've been talking to. Would you like to see it? I was like, oh, I've never heard that before. I would love to see it. So he reaches in his leather satchel, and I actually have a picture of us doing this together. He reaches in his leather satchel, he pulls out a sheaf of papers, and I was expecting like 70 or 80 names. There were 10,000 names. In his borough of Wandsworth, which is a suburb of London, it's about, I don't know, 160,000 people or so, something around there, 200,000. They had 10,000 conversations about climate change in 5 months. And as a result, the city council had just voted to declare a climate emergency. I mean, that just blew me away. I was like, really? And I mean, it's not like I didn't believe in the power of conversations, but I mean, a result of that magnitude in that short time, empowering people in his city, in his borough, to make a difference. And since then, the borough has gone on to have a 20 million pound fund for climate adaptation and resilience. And there's all kinds of other things. If you Google climate change in Wandsworth, all these headlines will pop up. And it's because one man started talking about climate change. I mean, isn't that just absolutely amazing? I'll see if I can actually find his picture. I think I have it on Instagram a while ago, but keep talking and
that's great. Yeah, maybe I'll just pose the last quick question with a 30-second answer.
Yes.
And that never works out well because the world is complex, but nonetheless. So we have a question here about just sort of the way action happens. And we often see, a trajectory of action being like slow to start, and then, really ticking up and accelerating later on, say into mid-century. But, what is your reaction to the feeling like we should actually reverse that and just, we need to be really ambitious and move fast now so that we can slow down and have sort of a wider margin for error in the future?
If we slow down, we're never going to make it.
Yeah.
It's like we scientists have been banging the gong saying that there is an iceberg up ahead for over 100 years, and the Titanic has steamed right into that iceberg. It hit the iceberg already. We're already sort of tilting. And now is not the time to slow down. Now is the time to be loading those lifeboats as quickly as possible, looking for the low-hanging fruit, the middle-hanging fruit, and those sort of moonshot solutions that Prince William and his foundation are funding, and moonshot solutions like a lot of big tech people are looking at. We need the whole thing. And so it's all hands on deck time. It's time for everybody to contribute everything that they can. And all of us have something we can contribute. And this is a good note to end on. What we have to contribute begins with our voice. All of us have our voice. And you know what? If the kids and the young people can be using their voices in the incredibly powerful way that they're doing today, can't the rest of us do that too? Right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was a really excellent conversation. I wish we could continue for hours and hours, but I think this draws our questions to a close. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Sarah, so much for this conversation. This has been fantastic. It's been a breath of fresh air. Climate scientists, man, great discussion. So no, this has been wonderful. And I love how, the news cycle sometimes gets sort of stuck in this sort of death loop of like sort of climate like nihilism. So it's nice to hear that how there are things we can do both on a hyper local level, but also it requires collective action, working together. They're not mutually exclusive categories. There's things that can be done. And also how climate change, how you said early on, how it impacts everything. If you're an economist, you're a farmer, you're an Amazon delivery driver, it affects all of us in that. So it's not something that you can just put in a box and say, oh, well, I'll deal with that, next week. I got to focus on something else tonight. So it's important in that. And in your book, the title, Saving Us, it's a great title, catchy in that, but it's also very sort of, this is kind of a big deal. We need to, this affects every single one of us. So I appreciate you joining us tonight. And Sarah, thank you for a great moderating there. Bringing your knowledge to the table as well and helping contextualize, the challenges and the hopes of what needs to be done for climate change. And hopefully in a few weeks in Glasgow, something can be done and we can make some further progress on a global scale. So for tonight's audience, thank you for spending your evening with us and for your questions. One lucky viewer will be entered into a draw to win Catherine's book, and we'll send you an email tomorrow. I'd like to give a special thanks to Rita Silva and the team at Simon Schuster Canada for their ongoing support of our author book launches at Kitchener Public Library. Rita's fantastic. So, and of course, we'd like to support, acknowledge Wordsworth Books, our local independent bookstore. We appreciate their ongoing support for our author events, and copies of Saving Us are in stock, and they are kindly offering a discount. All you have to do is mention that you came to this event. So that's pretty good. And with that, again, I want to spend special thanks to you, Catherine, and to you, Sarah. You were both wonderful tonight, and we really appreciate you spending the evening with us, and this is a very important discussion. So thank you, and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.